Well, I might get started seeing as it's 2 minutes past the clock. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Community Mental Health, Drug and Alcohol Research Network's Co-design Kickstarter workshop. My name is Katie Sam, and I am the project coordinator for CMHDARN. So I'll begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands of which we're all variously meeting. Today I'm working on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people attending today. And I would also like to recognise all those with lived experience of mental health conditions and substance use, and acknowledge the important contributions in informing policy service reform, particularly through research and evaluation. So thank you so very much for joining us today. There's been really tremendous interest in this workshop, and I hope that everyone is able to take something away from the session today. With the mix of presentation and interactive activities, I'm certain that you'll be able to build your knowledge and skills in co-design research. So before I hand over the reins to our wonderful facilitators, I'll just do a little bit of boring housekeeping. So if we could please try and keep muted if you're not wanting to engage with the group and during presentations, that would be greatly appreciated. And we of course encourage you to use the chat function throughout. We are due to finish at probably 3:30 today, and it's a very tight schedule to ensure that you all get the most out of this workshop. The presentation part of the workshop will be recorded and is being recorded for you to access later if you're unable to stay for the whole event. But we will turn off the recording for the activities and breakout sessions to ensure that everyone feels at ease to engage meaningfully. So I would now like to invite our fantastic lineup of facilitators and the authors of the Co-design Kickstarter to briefly introduce themselves, and then we could kick off with the session. So thank you so much. Brett, if you would like to start us off today.
Sure. Hi, my name's Brett. I'm a person with lived experience, one of the co-authors of the Kickstarter, and I'm sometimes a lived experience researcher, mostly working out of University of Technology, Sydney.
Fabulous. Maybe Bradley, if you'd like to go next.
Sure. Good morning, or it's good afternoon now, isn't it? We've clocked over noon. So Bradley Foxdown, co-author of the Co-design Kickstarter, and prior to that, the co-production Kickstarter. And what I've been doing over the last little while predominantly is peer supervision in the public mental health space, and looking into the values and principles that align with that. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Bradley. Gren, if you would like to introduce yourself to the group.
Yeah, hi, Grenville. I'm a proud ex-Piedmont squatter from the 70s and 80s. And then I went to uni, got a PhD in food preferences of all things, worked in commercial market research, but then started getting involved in lived experience with around hepatitis C in the early 2000s, 2002. And yeah, then worked for NGOs in a research position and gradually gravitating towards lived experience areas. And now I'm at the ANU with the Acacia unit, which is our lived experience research unit there for the moment. Well, I'm there for the moment. Thanks.
Fabulous. Thank you, Grenville. Kath, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Kath Thorburn, and I'm another one of the authors of the Co-design Kickstarter, co-founder and co-lead of Inside Out and Associates, which was really established along the lines of collaborative practices. And also currently a PhD candidate with the Centre for Primary Healthcare and Equity at the University of New South Wales. And yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much, Kath. And Joel, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Katie. So I'm Jo River. I'm also an author of the Co-design Kickstarter, but working from a learned rather than lived experience perspective. So a conventional researcher, predominantly in the field of mental health, drug and alcohol, social determinants of health. And I'm based at UTS and Northern Sydney Local Health Districts. I'm an associate professor of mental health, drug and alcohol in those two locations. So I'm really fortunate to be part of this team and to work alongside people with lived experience in a program of research called Raising the Bar, which is related to this work. So I'm really happy to be invited by Co-design to give this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jo. And we are expecting Emma Elder from the Black Dog Institute. I think she's just a little bit busy right now, but will be joining us hopefully later on. So maybe Bradley, if you want to get started in introducing the plan for today.
Happy to. Hi again. We have a bit of a plan for today. There's going to be a mix of speaking to co-design and what makes for co-design. There's also going to be activities in the second half of the webinar. There'll be a bunch of activities which requires going into breakout rooms and having discussions around particular questions. What we thought about was that we wanted to lean into kind of collecting empirical data, something to do with experience and something to do with having an experiment. And that's what we're kind of doing today. We've got lived and learned experience coming together, which is at the center of co-design. So we thought we'd lean into that idea in order that everybody got to have an experience and to have a bit of an experiment with playing with some of these ideas rather than just a talk fest around it. So we'll also have some examples along the way of co-production research or lived experience led co-production as well, just to show up some examples of how it's already being done and to help generate ideas as to how others can do some of the same. So that's, and we'll have a break in the middle and then we'll be done and it'll be great. Okay, I'll hand over to River if you want to talk about the co-designy bits.
Thanks, Bradley. So Bradley's given us an introduction of what we're going to cover, so I won't go over that slide again, but I might just go on to the next slide. So as many of you know, there are lots of co-words and approaches, and the landscape seems like somewhat cluttered. So lots of words that we hear all the time: co-design, co-production, cooperative inquiry, co-construction, many, many more, participatory action, research, many kinds of words that kind of allude to this collaborative approaches to research. And as Williams and colleagues here point out, the confusion can often create a space for misappropriation of terms and practices that really are not truly collaborative, and often reduce lived experience partnership to tokenism, which is kind of a word that really actually is talking about a level of participation where people have very little power over the decision-making processes. And really that maintains the power and control firmly in the hands of conventional or learned experience researchers. So the Co-design Kickstarter was, I guess, an attempt to create some clarity around that, in an effort to support genuine and meaningful partnership in research between lived experience and learned experience researchers. Okay, so moving on, I think just to give some idea of where we were coming from, I might just go to the next slide. So there are a lot of ladders out there and tables. You'll see them through the NHMRC. Different organisations often create their own ladders and tables. And really, a lot of these tables we were finding as a team actually tended to focus more on the levels of lived experience engagement, often in development of policies or interventions or models of care. So, and it was very hard to actually map onto it what levels of research engagement. And so the classic absolute, standout was Sherry Arnstein's 1969 ladder of participation, which was a ladder of citizen participation, which was a guide really to discern decision-making processes in organizations between citizens and employees of an organization. So Arnstein wasn't talking about research, but it's useful to look at how she mapped power and decision-making in the ladder. And so at the bottom, you see that kind of non-participation where things are done to people. So things like therapy, yes, it's somewhat of a two-way process, but the decision-making power stays with the therapist largely in terms of how it's delivered. And towards that tokenism, what she called tokenism, which might also include consultation. Consultation obviously can be really meaningful and purposeful and really useful as a precursor to co-design, but in and of itself, people don't have decision-making power. So I can go to people, ask them their views, and I walk away and I make the decisions about how I will incorporate those. And then at those higher levels, she talked about delegation and partnership, where you begin to see that real decision-making power that people have within teams up into the point of citizen control. And then on the other side of the consumer-led, negotiated and non-consumer-led was developed by Kath Roper and Flick Gray and Emma Gadigan. And that's an interesting way as well of looking at the kind of those three tiers of participation. But our team decided that we needed, just to add to the clutter, we needed another ladder. But a ladder that actually helped us really think about what's happening in the field of research, the kinds of terms that we're using in research, and how do they map to that ladder? So of course, exclusion, that might be like lab research where there are no involvement of humans. But then we have that beginning point where a lot of research sits, which is where people with lived experience as subjects or participants in research. You could argue that there's some two-way with the participation in research, but it's still the case that people don't have power over the design of the actual research project. And then that going up to doing for, where people maybe are consulted as a reference or advisory group or as an individual or group of people. And that is what Sherry Arnstein would call the level of tokenism, because although people are consulted, they don't necessarily have power of the design or conduct of a study. And then up to that doing with, which is the co-design and co-production. And obviously there are some distinctions between those, which we do distinguish in the co-design Kickstarter and co-production Kickstarter. Well, where that's the beginning point of real partnership, where there's decision-making, I guess, maybe in a nutshell, we might say co-designing is co-deciding. So the decision-making is equal between lived experience and learned experience researchers, and all the way to lived experience-led research, which may involve learned experience researchers, but is led and designed by people with lived experience. So I think we had our first example, which Kath Thorburn is going to give, of working together from the very beginning in a co-design or co-production approach. Thanks, Kath.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. So I guess if you do happen to be looking at the Co-design Kickstarter, you'll find the information about co-planning on pages 9 and 10. And co-planning includes, building relationships, talking about the research aims and objectives, where it might be, who the project team might comprise of, governance, roles and responsibilities, and also resources, so things like budget, payment and timeframes. And the example I wanted to give for this is the recent Alternatives to Suicide research project. And this was research that sought to understand the experience of attending peer-to-peer support groups for people who've made suicide attempts or who experience suicidal thoughts. So in this instance, it was actually a peer-led organisation off the wall that approached a conventional researcher who was known for their critical mental health stance. And that actually occurred almost a year before funding was actually granted for the research. So in that period, relationships were built as well as kind of the sharing of ideas around the research aims and objectives and who would be involved, roles, governance, etc. And the research budget, that had actually also been developed by Off the Wall, which is the peer-led organisation I was referring to, in collaboration with Inside Out, the organisation I'm a part of. So Inside Out was originally a partner in this project, and then took on coordination at the invitation of Off the Wall. And as I said, for those of you who aren't familiar, Inside Out is a co-founded, co-led organisation. So all of the way we work kind of is based from a co-creative, I guess, stance is the language we would often choose to use. So once the funding was actually obtained, more specific conversations grew from those original conversations, particularly around project governance, roles and responsibilities, resources and processes. And at that point, a co-design group was established to determine the research design, the roles of lived experience researchers and conventional researchers, and the processes for recruiting them, and also the ethics application itself. So there was collaboration around that too. So I think that is an example of how it's possible to engage in co-planning before project recruitment occurs. I think a critical factor there was that project timelines were such that once funds became available, some were directed to the co-planning process itself. I know that's not always the case. In other instances, it might be that seed funding needs to be obtained in order to support the planning process. And I guess the other thing I would just want to mention before I hand back to Jo is that in other co-planning examples, the research team of lived experience and conventional researchers might already be established. It wasn't in this instance. And that obviously, we would always strongly maintain that at least 50% of those teams should comprise lived experience or peer researchers. So yeah, that's the example I thought I'd give, and I'll hand back to you, Jo and Brett.
Thanks, Kath. So just to we're going to go through, and you'll see where Kath was talking about that particular project. So when we came to create the Co-design Kickstarter, what we started from the point was, co-design is this big buzzword at the moment and everyone in universities, in health sector, in the community sector, but there's a lot of confusion about what it actually is. And so the Co-design Kickstarter, we looked at the evidence base of what are people saying that co-design is, what's the history of it, where has it come from, what are the influences on co-design, and we wanted to resolve some of that confusion, but we also really quite deliberately set out to create a bar for minimum standards of practice for co-design research that would meet the needs of affected communities, and also the Consumer Survivor and Disability Rights call for nothing about us without us. So it was, what would be the bar be for that? And you can see here, this is kind of a very basic outline of how we set that bar. So at the highest level, we distinguish an approach which we call substantive co-design research. And that's participation that is continuous from that point of planning that Kath was talking about, all the way through defining the actual design of the study, conducting the study, around to dissemination, and then maybe another cycle again. And at that point, at that very high level, nearly indistinguishable from co-production research, although there are arguably still some quite important differences. And then we distinguish a level that we call the bare minimum level. And that was co-deciding, at least in key stages of the research. So including the research design, co-deciding any deviations in the design, and co-interpretation and dissemination of research findings. But we'd like to stress that that bare minimum standard was determined with lived experience researchers to ensure that meaningful participation of people with lived experience through at least a minimum level of stages for it to be considered to have met sort of minimum requirements for engagement of people with lived experience. And we also determined a level that we called faux design, which is quite the fashion, I'd say, in health research. So it points to research may have some degree of consultation or collaboration, but would be considered by Sherry Arnstein to meet the level of tokenism, in that people with lived experience have little, if any, true power over the research design and process. So on many occasions, as many people can testify, researchers are consulting, conventional researchers are consulting with a group of people with lived experience and then calling it co-design. And it's important that we distinguish this as potentially as consultation. And one of the reasons we wanted to kind of create that clear distinction was because if we really want to kind of get up to substantive or at least minimum bar level of co-design research, which actually requires resources and pay and time. And we wanted to ensure that we had a way of speaking about that kind of higher level practice in order to secure those kinds of resources. So the Co-design Kickstarter also distinguishes co-design or co-creation of an intervention or a model. So you can see that blue box at the bottom. So that actually distinguishing between co-design of research, co-design of interventions or models or things, because sometimes it is reported even in publications that something is co-design research, but actually if you really dig down and read a little bit deeper, what actually has happened is there's been co-design of an intervention or a thing, and then that's been evaluated, but people with lived experience were not necessarily involved in any of the design of the evaluation or the interpretation of any data. And it shouldn't really, and we really wanted to make sure that co-design of things and interventions and services is really fantastic work, but it is something quite different to co-design of actual evaluation and research. So I think we were trying to distinguish that. So if I go to the next slide, so this kind of focus here is just on substantive co-design. You can, in the actual Co-design Kickstarter, you can read more about the bare minimum levels and what the distinctions are and what the kind of the I guess we called it the does it pass the pub test for co-design, you know, what is the minimal level required. So substantive co-design, and I think I mentioned this already, is that continuous process through the co-planning, co-defining, co-conducting and co-dissemination. So to dig down into what that is, so on the next slide, you can see a little bit more of the details of what co-planning is. So co-planning, and this is where Kath was talking about building those relations, discussing aims, objectives, the location, the project team, maybe the funding, the governments, the roles, all of those, that business that needs to be done before we even begin to design an actual study. And then the co-defining is talking about the design of the study. And that's where people are working together to define what is the study protocol, including what's the problem we're going to solve, what's the population, what aims and questions or hypotheses are we going to make, what methods are we going to use, what conceptual frameworks, what's the ethical concerns that we need to consider, who would we recruit, who's the population, how would we recruit them, you know, what data we're going to collect and how we analyze and disseminate it. So all those big decisions in research. And then co-conducting is working in partnership with people to undertake the research in accordance with the study design, as any studies do. But it's that kind of governance structure throughout the project. It doesn't necessarily mean that work may be delegated to particular groups to do a particular thing. So for example, people with lived experience may actually conduct the interviews, or they may be conducted by, or data may be gathered by a conventional researcher. But the point here is that everyone has decision-making power throughout the conduct of that research, should there be any decisions that need to be made about the or changes to the design. And then there's co-interpretation of the data to really understand and contextualize the findings, which is really vital, because if it is always, data is always analyzed by conventional researchers, they tend to kind of revert to norms in terms of thinking around what that data means. And then co-dissemination is the dissemination of the research together, and which may actually be in traditional and non-traditional formats, ideally in both, in order to actually meet the needs of different communities. And obviously people being acknowledged in those publications or outputs. So we also theorize that within each of those sections, so in the co-planning, the co-defining, the co-conduct and the co-dissemination, if you go to the next slide, you can see that there's these kind of what we call design loops. And this actually relates back a lot to the influence of participatory action research in co-design. So it's that in each of those things, we go through a process. It's not a necessarily linear process, but this is the best we can do with a diagram. but it's that we're exploring and thinking together, we're synthesizing and prioritizing what it is we're going to focus on, making decisions and taking actions together, and then reviewing and thinking about what are our next steps. And that's kind of like the process we're constantly going through. We may even do a few rounds in each time we meet. Okay, so I think now we have our next example, which is Bradley Fox-Lewin's fantastic study, which is lived experience-led study. Thanks, Bradley.
Oh, hello again. Yeah, I'm rewinding the clock back to 2012, when this study was actually conducted or completed. It took about 2 years, and this is in the time when co-design and co-production was not part of the ordinary parlance, the ordinary conversations that people were having. In fact, what was more common was that consumer or lived experience researchers couldn't really be kind of articulated in the same sentence. So we are going back a little ways, and I want to acknowledge that we've come some part of the way towards acknowledging the value of including lived experience in research, and the whys and wherefores of that and the benefits of that. I just want to talk to this project a little bit, and to help people understand why it was co-designed, and how it was co-designed. Originally, the idea came forward out of the study was called "What's Happening at the Seclusion Review That Makes a Difference, a Consumer-Led Research Study." That came out of a thing called the Seclusion Review Meeting, which was about checking out what was happening at the Psychiatric Services Unit in Canberra around seeking to reduce seclusion. And it has some statistical data within this report that actually articulates how seclusion rates moved from 16% of people who stayed on the unit down to less than 1% of people who accessed the Psychiatric Services Unit over a period of some years. And what we sought to do was canvass and present the experience of that happening, rather than try and prove anything necessarily. What we wanted to do was present a picture of how that occurred. So back in 2011 or early 2011, I developed a research presentation that I took to the Directorate of Mental Health in the ACT, and that was funded out of a little piece of research, a little piece of funding that was tacked onto the end of the Seclusion and Restraint Review Meeting funding, a little $10,000 amount that was had earmarked for consumer education. So that's where this funding actually came from to develop this project, and it actually turned into a far bigger project than could possibly be achieved in $10,000. And I think I worked out that somehow I was paid 75 cents an hour or something like that, in collaboration with my peers in developing and initiating it. One of the first steps that we took was a co-design approach around seeking learned experience in order to make it co-designed, because if it doesn't have lived and learned experience, it's not co. But that was led from a lived experience-led perspective. And the first perspective came through consultations with a lived experience reference group out of the ACT Mental Health Consumer Network to ask the question, how might this be done? How might our methodology and our approach be friendly or accredited by lived experience, people with lived experience of the very thing that we were talking about researching? So that began the process of what we termed a thing called taking back practices, which is a thing that's kind of like borrowed from narrative community development approaches, as taking back to those who are most impacted by the research itself, whether the approach or the methodology actually fit with what people understood to be valuable and how it might make a difference in their own community. So that part of it was returned to that group 4 times over the life of the project to make sure that in some ways, to make sure that Bradley Fox Lewin wasn't being colonized by the larger research system and actually doing something that was lived experience led. So that was part of it, but it was also to really reiterate the co-piece of what we were trying to do. And another co-piece was actually seeking a learned experience researcher in Professor Beverly Raphael, ANU of ANU fame. And I remember having a conversation with her about the research, and she said, Bradley, I'm just going to get out of your way, because it's not lived experience led, it's not co if I take over this project. So I'm going to get out of the way, and what I need you to do is come and approach me if you want any input on any particular thing that you can benefit from my conventional research standpoint, which I did on several occasions because I didn't know everything about everything, and I wanted to be able to draw on that. But I absolutely got to give her credit for taking that standpoint, and because her action actually was very much part of elevating lived experience by saying, I'm going to step out of the road and allow for this to unfold, and you ask for what you need. How we wanted to make it co as well, in particularly the co-defining part, is that we wanted to have these research methodology match the process of what was happening at the seclusion review, to have the methodology actually match what was occurring in the activity that we were researching. A lot of the activity, or most of the activity in the seclusion reduction space, was actually about centering lived experience as to how do we make decisions around changing practice if we don't center lived experience. And that was very much established and enabled by lived experience representatives from the ACT Mental Health Consumer Network, which was another layer of the co-design elements of the project. When we wanted to mirror what was happening, we would then go back to the CRG and say, okay, what methods would actually work to mirror what's happening on the thing that we're actually studying? And what we came up with together was that we would borrow from narrative community development processes through a thing called definitional ceremony. Definitional ceremony has two elements. One, the definitional bit is how do you define a problem? And the ceremony bit means what do you put in place to actually have lived experience at the center of everything that you do? So definitional ceremony starts and finishes with the experience of lived experience and gets added to by learned experience, rather than turning it upside down in the other way, which is conventional. And the other thing that we did was did a second analysis through a process of collective biography, where again we centered lived experience stories and had people add to that from different knowledges and different standpoints, rather than turning it back up the other way, which would have been conventional ways of going about things. And all of those taking back practices centered lived experience at the center of everything that we do, but it never took away from anybody else's knowledge about how we might actually do more effective work in reducing seclusion over time. So I just wanted to present that, and present that particular example as a co-designed process that maybe could have been more co-designed in certain areas. But in the landscape where we were just beginning to start talking about these things, it kind of ticked a fair few of the boxes just by making sense of whose experience should be at the center, where it affects that community, and how do we talk to that, and what methods do we bring to that process. So I'm going to hand back to Brett. And thanks for the opportunity to say those things.
Thanks, Bradley. I think we got a taste there of how complex and layered trying to do things in co-designed ways can be. But there's lots of challenges and potential pitfalls. And I guess without coining the phrase faux design, there's always the chance that someone else like me might be sitting back and saying you're not doing it right. So in that case, why bother at all? Why co-design research? Well, there's a few reasons that we came up with. And the first is a very pragmatic reason, that we know that the co-design of research improves the relevance and quality of research priorities, interpretation, and translation. The research is deeper and better, and it's more fit for purpose, particularly for affected communities or people with lived experience. Secondly, we know that lived experience and conventional research partnerships that co-design support innovative research design practices and perspectives, and that new and different knowledge is possible when we do things in new and different ways. So if we keep doing things the same way, we end up with some version of the same outcome. We know that co-design, as I heard Joe say earlier, and Bradley talk about then as well, we know that co-design of research is becoming more expected by communities, policymakers, and funding bodies, which on one hand is great and is the product of a lot of hard work and activism and research by people with lived experience, and is great to see. But on the other hand, also seems to be driving a lot of tokenistic and at best consultative research, dressing itself up as genuine collaboration. And finally, we know that there are important political reasons for doing research collaboratively, for working in co-designed ways. That people with lived experience have a right to participate in the design of things that impact them, including research. One of the demands of the disability movement is nothing about us without us. This includes knowledge production. People with lived experience have historically been excluded from research. And today, research is still largely controlled by sort of experts, which has flow-on impacts to policy and practice, and services and the lives of people with lived experience. We might go forward a slide, if that's okay. Research, as usual, tends to support existing power structures and often does not meet the stated needs of affected communities or the growing expectation that research is conducted in partnership with rather than on people with lived experience. In this sense, substantively co-designed or co-produced or lived experience-led research can begin to redress this epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice is that injustice that occurs when oppressed persons or groups are denied full and equal recognition and status as knowers or reliable narrators or having wisdom or expertise, and should be seen as a form of justice doing. Or as one of the lived experience researchers who participated in Raising the Bar said, the problem of exclusionary research practice is a collective pain and a collective responsibility. And when there's no space to do that or no listening people to do that, then there's a cultural shame. Co-design research or collaborative research is the start of restoring dignity for us as individuals with lived experience, but hopefully also for our community. So I think that was my very short version of why bother, and hopefully I've convinced you. I know there's a lot of people in the meeting today who could probably speak to why do co-design much better and much longer than I could, but I think I'm going to hand over to Emma for an example now.
Thanks, Brad. I'll introduce myself. My name's Emma Elder. I am the Lived Experience Engagement Program Manager here at Black Dog. I apologise I wasn't here at the beginning. It's because my computer decided to die, which is always a great time. So thank you, and it's good to be here. So I'm talking about co-conducting the research. So something, my job here at Black Dog is to support the researchers and people with lived and living experience to actually work together as a team and work together on our research projects. So we can have anywhere from 20 to 25 research projects happening per year with people with lived and living experience involved. And I want them at the highest level of engagement that we can possibly get to. So at the moment, we've got 5 co-design research projects going, and this is one of them as the example that I'm going to give. I think something that happens is that I often get asked by researchers, I understand that I should be doing co-design, but what does that practically mean? What does that practically look like? So I thought I'd just go through a bit of an example that gives you a bit of a practical idea of things that are happening. So who was involved? There is 3 people with lived and living experience that are involved in this project, and then the researcher. The researcher actually doesn't have their own lived experience in this project. So it's the 3 people who we call advisors with lived and living experience who are bringing that lived experience lens to this project. The project is looking at what impact do side effects from SSRI antidepressants have on wellbeing and medication adherence. That question came from the researcher, but the researcher was very open to asking the advisors what they thought of that question and whether they thought that question needed to be changed. So that was really great of the researcher to be open to that. And after them discussing the question and discussing all the things that they could look at and what could be involved, they settled on this being the question that they wanted to focus on. We've got lots of key decisions that need to be made. And just like Joe and everybody else has been saying, it's really about what are the key decisions that you're making in your research that people with lived and living experience should be and can be involved in. So they needed to hear about where this question came from, why the researcher wanted to explore this, what had they looked at in the past around this question. It happened to be that this researcher had done a lit review a couple of years ago that was similar to this, and that's where they got the question from. Of course, in the perfect world, it would be great to have people with lived and living experience involved in that actual lit review. Then they needed to look at what the benefits and the objectives were of this research study. They needed to discuss the scope, what was in scope and what was out of scope in this study. Needed to talk about the assumptions that are coming with this study. What were the key risks? Are there protocols around risks? Is there processes in place? Develop those processes and protocols together if they didn't exist. What are the study methods that they were going to use? Timeline and budget is something that needs to always be discussed and is great when we're transparent about that, because it gets everyone on the same page and everyone can understand when things need to happen and why they need to happen in a particular time frame. And as we all know, funders are always a big reason as to why time and budget is an issue in projects. And then how is this knowledge going to be translated to the public, or where is it going to be shared? After all the discussions that the advisors and the researchers had, or the researcher had, they decided that they actually wanted to conduct interviews first. They felt like they needed to discuss with people with lived and living experience first, some things to find out what sort of survey questions they would want. So by conducting the interviews first, they were able to then take everything that came from the interviews and develop some survey questions. So they designed the interview questions together. They discussed what sort of methods of interviewing they wanted to do, and there was lots of different ideas around how you would interview. Would you interview with in a particular way and not just asking questions? They discussed participant recruitment. Where would they find the participants? Who would the participants be, and why would they need to be particular people? The consent process and the ethics process was discussed with the advisors, people with lived and living experience. And after that, at the moment, the project is in looking at the data from the interviews. So the people with lived and living experience, the advisors that are involved in this project, are actually going through and they're coding the transcripts of the interviews. They needed some capacity building, or they needed to learn about that process. So we've helped them learn that process and know how to do that process. There's lots of checking in, checking out with within the team to make sure everybody's doing that correctly. Then they're going to analyze that data together. And then from that, they're actually going to come up with survey questions from what has come out of the interviews. So we haven't made it to the survey part yet, but we know that when we get to that part, that the advisors are going to be helping with developing the questions, talking about survey methods. Again, participant recruitment, who are we going to be asking these survey questions to, the consent process and the ethics process. I'm just going to pass it back to Brett, and thank you.
Thanks, Emma. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we called, what we talk about co-design research being a mindset, which we sort of borrow, I think, or were inspired. Perhaps we were inspired by the work of K.A. McKercher, who does phenomenal work around co-design, and we have plenty of references to their work in our reference list. we wanted to talk particularly around how to keep the connection and the collaboration in co-design. I think it's really important to remember that co-design research is about the relationship that you build within your research team, and that takes time to develop a real partnership, to build sort of trust. And you can't force trust. It develops as it develops, and it can take a lot of time. And that to develop and maintain connections, not just within your small research team, but also with the community of people that you're looking to engage with around your research question. And then I guess we talk about, and as Joe said, we really think at its core, co-design is about co-deciding. It's about that shared power and shared decision making. And without that, you're really not co-designing. The other half is keeping the design in co-design research, which is not one of my greatest strengths, but yet I am the one speaking to this slide, so I'll do my best. The co-design research perhaps shouldn't look and feel like business as usual research processes. When we do things in the same way, we'll tend to include the same sort of people. We'll tend to have the same sort of results, which tends to be text in traditional research, tends to be text-based, highly conceptual, hypothetical, rationalized, and intellectualized. There's room for that in co-design as well. But I think if we're really going to work in co-design research, co-design ways in our research, we've really got to look towards embodied and collective processes, arts-based methods, rapid prototyping, collective making practices, which really I think allow for the sort of devolution of expertise, so that the person who comes from the conventional research background no longer maintains sort of sole claim to expertise. It really elevates that lived experience. I think I heard Bradley talk to that before. And it's really important to think about if you're going to try and do something in a co-design way, particularly research. I think we've got another slide about power. So we have a quote here on the slide from Mary O'Hagan. If you've heard me speak about power before, you've probably heard me read this before, because it's one of my favorite quotes. Mary says that power is an uneven and invisible resource like oxygen. Often people only notice power when they don't have it. They are like people exiled to the mountaintops who gasp because they don't have enough oxygen, while the privileged people at sea level breathe so comfortably they never have to think about the supply of oxygen. Power is definitely something that you will have to reckon with working in co-design teams, in doing co-design research. I think it's important to have these conversations about power early and often. If you're coming from the conventional or the traditionally more empowered position, these can be particularly uncomfortable conversations, but I don't think we as a society do a good number on having conversations about power just generally. So that often they're quite uncomfortable for all parties, and but really vital, and again something that might take time and need to be reconsidered or revisited many times. But more than just having conversations, I think it's important to take some real actions to try and equalize some of the power relations that might be, or power dynamics that might be going on in your research team. So for example, I think Kath talked about numbers. So at least half the people in the team should be people with lived experience, which is that's the starting point. That's like your sort of ground zero. But then you've also got to think about hours, because if you've only got so many hours budgeted for lived experience input, but yet your conventional researchers are going to be working on it, three or four times as much. That's also a place where power can sort of slip in. I think you've got to think about positions and precarity. So if you're a lived experience researcher, you'll probably be trying to make good connections and hopefully have good relationships with conventional researchers, since conventional researchers are often the ones who can attract the funding and therefore get you a job. So that's a very precarious position to be in, right? Like how far are you going to go when perhaps you're putting your future as a lived experience researcher at risk? And I think it's On the other hand, I also think that's a really hard ask for conventional researchers to be put in that position. So I think we're looking at sort of system change situations that need to happen to address that. So pay, and I think process. I think process was the other P that I wanted to talk about. Processes that can really address that structural and interpersonal inequalities of power. Some of those might be sort of shared agenda making, shared or rotating chairing if you're having sort of traditional type meetings, shared documentation. These processes and more might be necessary to help shift that power in a real way so that your team can really cohere together and undertake the process of co-design research. But more so than whatever's going on for power within the team, I think it's also important to take a moment to consider the forces and powers that are acting on the team from outside. Particularly these tend to be the expectations and paradigms of organizations and funding bodies, so things like universities or health services. And these are often like sort of invisible or hidden sources of power, and ways that power sort of can deform a research project despite the best efforts of everybody involved in the team. So it's important for the team to have conversations about that as well. So at least you're making it visible, and you can then together come up with a way to sort of hopefully address and account for that. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. And I think, Joe, you might have an example around co-dissemination.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So I was just reflecting on the ideas of power, actually, because the example I want to give is a project that was looking at functional and neurological disorder, working with a team of people, lived experience researchers, who basically, right from the beginning, and I guess it kind of even might meet the bar for co-production research, because the question came from the community of people with lived experience in the first place. That question was really about what are the skills and knowledge that people have in navigating their daily lives living with functional neurological disorder, as well as navigating health services, and how do health services respond in positive ways that are supportive, or ways that actually create a surplus form of suffering for people with lived experience. So this is a picture of Kate and I, Kate Gill, Dr. Kate Gill and I co-presenting. So Kate Gill is the founder and director of FND Support Services Australia, and a very skilled lived experience researcher. And so Kate and I were invited to speak at the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists to a room full of psychiatrists, and so very interesting experience, because of course the kind of positioning within psychiatry of FND has actually been largely responsible for many of the problems that people have suffered. So the notion of it being conversion disorder and seen as a voluntary kind of a voluntary state that people are in, as opposed to actually involuntary experience that people are having. So so you can see us here, we're sharing, and Kate is actually speaking, but we're sharing the presentation. So the dissemination goes down to that kind of level of sharing presentation, although it doesn't have to. So Kate might go and present this work separately to me, but really, or I might present it in a different forum, just because it gives us extra opportunities to disseminate the research, but always within that acknowledging each other and each other's part in that work. Also, I mean, it's very powerful because Kate is presenting, and I think you can't really see the slide, but presenting on experiences of people living with FND, while she herself is actually living and managing the challenges of FND and dealing with health systems herself that are often failing to meet her own needs. So that's the formal presentation, and other members of the team who lived experience and researchers and learned experience researchers have also created other opportunities to disseminate research, including via webcasts. And we're also co-writing 2 publications together at the moment, and considering other non-traditional forms of research outputs. But it's not, I'd just like to say, it's really, and I think it's an important point, it's not about just cutting the pie in half and halving the work. really what is most important here is about sharing the decision-making power about how we disseminate the research and what's most important to do. So, for example, if someone is particularly skilled in an area, it might be that the work is delegated to them. So in this case, when it comes to co-writing the publications, Kate Gill is very, very knowledgeable about FND. So we'll be relying on her really to write up that background piece about FND. Whereas there might be other people in the team who have more knowledge of the specific methodologies that we used in the research, and they might be writing up that section. So you can see it's really about expertise and decision making that is the core of that collaborative effort. So that's what I'll speak about that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We've actually reached our short break section for the session today, and thankfully our great authors and facilitators have smashed through all that content, so there's a bit extra time for the fun bit, the activities. So if you'd like to take a short break and come back for us to kick off the activities at 22, so 1:40. So get yourself a cup of tea, stretch your legs, and then time for some active engagement. So we'll see you shortly at 1:40. Thank you.